Okay. Boy, we're going to talk about a lot. I'm actually going to, and this is going to shock you, I'm actually going to go through the PowerPoints. I know, it's a shock. I don't want you to get lost. This is the section, this is the unit that you guys will all understand, because it's all European type stuff. You guys all know about World War I, World War II. It's totally not new to you. Okay? But I'm still going to focus on the themes. So I'm going to cover the facts as storylines, but I'm not going to give you big details. So it's going to be this weird, I'm going to actually cover over the facts, but I'm not going to give you any of them. Not very many. Not as many, I mean, just like I normally do. But the thing is that you'll notice some of these things. You'll be familiar to you. So don't be tricked into thinking that I'm giving you the whole story. You still need to read. That's where the details will come out. The good news of a broad overview is you know where to pick up your stories. Does that make sense? 1800s and 19th century is very confusing for people in Europe because you suddenly have lots and lots of countries, and then suddenly you get new countries that pop up out of them. And so you're using names like Prussia, which nobody ever hears of, and then suddenly you have Germany, and it's not easy to understand the connection between these. So what I'm going to try to do is, last class, I talked about the empires kind of spinning out, and that the competition between these empires is what led to World War I. Well, I want you to understand this more specifically today. And if I'm going to be specific, what I want you to understand is Europe's trend in nationalism and diplomacy. And this is very much a Western Civ topic, so I'm just going to warn you, I'm not going to give you as many details, because what I really want you to get is what is being diffused. You understand what I'm saying by this? Remember, I went over all the units, and every unit we're talking about Europe going out and reaching out, right? Well, in this 20th century, it's World War I, World War II, and we're still kind of at the beginning of this unit. And the question is, what is being diffused by these examples? You're going to have Germany starting up and being a country. Well, in order to be a country, you've got to fight lots and lots of wars. Italy is going to rise up and be a country. It wasn't a country before. It was just a bunch of little city-states. So what did they do? What did the rest of the world kind of see from that? Second thing I want you to get, how is the United States different? Okay, and from this, what does it diffuse? So, if I can put this in a big picture, we've got 4 lectures here. We've got pre-World War I, which is I just talked about on Monday. We're going to have World War I this lecture. We're going to have World War II this lecture. And then we're going to talk about the Cold War, but mainly in terms of decolonization, because for world history, we're much more concerned about how this is affecting the world. But you should know, if you don't know already, the Cold War is fought in the previously colonized regions. The Cold War is fought in the Third World. Why is that? You don't have to know any knowledge, but you can take a wild guess. Why do the main powers of the Cold War, which would be the West, would be the U.S. and the Allies, England, France, and the Soviet Union and China, these are the 2 main powers, why do they choose to fight in Third World countries?
Don't mess up them.
I mean, that's it, right? Because what happens if they fight directly?
There's going to be more damage.
It's World War III. If you have World War III, can you not use the biggest weapons in your arsenal? If you are actually being threatened and you might lose, can you keep these weapons in reserve and say we're not going to use them? And what are our biggest weapons? Nuclear weapons. So if we have main powers fighting after World War II, if we have main powers fighting directly, can we avoid nuclear war? No. So you have to have indirect fighting. That's why it's called a Cold War instead of a war. You guys don't know this, is not part of your history, but when I was in high school, the Cold War was still going on. It doesn't end until 1991, right? And so when I was in high school in the late 80s, we would talk about this all the time. And it's hard for you to imagine this, but when I was in high school, my friends, they never thought it would end. They thought it was a permanent condition. The United States and the Soviet Union would always be on the brink of nuclear war. They had movies about, the end of nuclear war.
Well, you grew up in Alaska, right?
I did.
Being that close to Russia, does that have anything to do with it too? Or?
No. Although it's funny because I don't know if you know anything about Anchorage, but we're on this bowl, and right behind us are these mountains that go up a mile. So it's beautiful to see all these mountains. Well, up in those mountains are little missile silos, right there, and they go. That's where and not all of them are there, but that's where some of the silos are, right? So we knew that, but we were also not going to be hurt. It wasn't the closeness or the proximity; it was a national issue. I know you guys ever saw Red Dawn. Okay, they had a remake of it, kind of totally out of place now, but then Red Dawn was about Soviet Union, right? And you had the day after, which was about what happens the day after nuclear war. I mean, this fear of nuclear war was there. So in high school, I remember people saying, we'll never end this. And the irony of ironies is by the time I was a junior in high school, it's done. But if you imagine, the war starts, Cold War starts in 1947, and by 1980s, it's been 40 years, and so they thought that it would never end. And yet it ended really quick. My point here is that these two questions, if you look at the big picture, what we are looking at is predominantly Europe dominating the world. And in World War I, which is over empires, it's still mostly Europe. But at this time, the U.S. is a really big power. In World War II, who is becoming a major leader?
The U.S.
The U.S. Okay. Now, it doesn't dominate right before the war. Before the war, the U.S. is really on the sidelines. But once we get into the war, then things change. And so, it's U.S. is rising, and who's really dominating in the Cold War? The U.S., and who's on the other side? Now, clearly France and England and people are on our side, but who's on the other side? Soviet Union, right? USSR. Those are the two main forces. So then we look at these questions. What was Europe diffusing in this era? What was Europe peddling? That makes sense? And what did the United States introduce? And hopefully just by looking at the questions, you know they're not the same thing. Does this make sense? The U.S. begins to start peddling this here, not very successful, but it becomes successful in World War II, and it becomes the dominant thing today. And you know this, the concept of human rights, where does this come from?
John Locke.
It does. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. And I don't care where you go, people can understand the concept of human rights, right? And it's what defines the existence of our country. And yet, it was not a concept that was big in World War I. It becomes a concept in World War II. And it's not just because the United States is super powerful and great, we're going to shove it down everybody's throat. Why would human rights become most important? Again, this is the whole story. We haven't told it yet, but you guys know enough about general history to kind of guess this. Why would human rights become such a big issue during and after, especially after World War II?
The Holocaust.
Of course. Absolutely. Hitler is like the epitome of anti-human rights. And not just Hitler, Stalin, right? Mao Zedong. So the Cold War, if it's anything, is really a contest between the rule of law and the rule of might. And guess which side is which? So what we're talking about today is I want to go over World War I, and what I'm really doing, and I'm going to give you lots of stories and details, but don't get weighed down by this. The bigger story is just talking about what Europe is bringing to the table up to World War I, and the fact that the United States doesn't participate. When the war starts, we are very explicit. We are not going to participate. Now, did we end up participating?
Yeah.
Yeah, we did. But why? You don't know this. You guys had USS. You should remember it. Maybe you don't. You don't have to know this. Why is it that we participate?
Sinking the Lusitania.
No, that's a good start. That happens in 1915. It causes us to be upset. It's what? That's part of it. It's unrestricted submarine warfare. The Lusitania causes the United States to say, you cannot do that. You cannot be sinking ships without identifying it. It's against the rules of war. It's against the rules of war, right? And what's funny is that Germany says, okay, we won't. And for 2 years, they don't. And as a result, they follow the rules of war. As a result, they pop up and their submarines get sunk out of the blue. Lose thousands. And so after that, they get to a point of desperation when they say we're going to declare unrestricted submarine warfare, plus the Zimmerman telegram, but basically saying we're going to shoot everything we see. And the United States gets involved not because we have anything against Germany, not because we particularly like England, but because we believe that we need to protect the rights of neutrals to be able to live without being sucked into a war. And we are very powerful. We're the only country that can do it, so that's what we do it. And so when we enter in, we are introducing a new concept into the global arena. And at the time, we have an amazing amount of faith that this will work. The League of Nations. This is pre-United Nations. It's not the same. The League of Nations was our idea. It's an American idea. That we will have this Congress. It's basically like a Congress of all the countries. And if we have this Congress, we'll never have war again. Because people, when they have a problem, they'll just take it to the League of Nations. We'll talk about it. We'll be reasonable. And we will never have war again. Now, you can understand why this is a hugely optimistic idea. But we, in 1915, 1920, were amazingly optimistic as a country. We call it progressivism, right? It dominated our country. We call it, historians refer to that as the progressive era. My kind of, you could call it my interpretation of history is from that era, progressivism. Not exactly the same, but kind of. Progressivism is the idea that we progress over time. That the future is better than the past. Most of you kind of think that way in terms of technology, but don't really think of it in terms of other things. We're a remarkably cynical lot nowadays. But not in 1920. They had amazing confidence that we could fix this. Now, obviously, it didn't work. There's lots of reasons why it didn't work, and I'll talk about these in turn, but I'll just give you one example. In 1929, the United States, we came up with this idea of the League of Nations, but I'll explain. We don't actually end up joining the League of Nations. We get very disillusioned. I'll explain this when we get there. I'll just say that we felt betrayed. And so we were worried that what England was bringing was still dominating. That their trends are what was dominating diplomacy. And so we were afraid that we didn't want to be part of it. So we didn't join the League of Nations. But that didn't mean that we were out. So this treaty called the Kellogg-Briand Pact in 1929. Kellogg-Briand. Kellogg was the Secretary of State in the United States. Briand was the Secretary of State in France. It was a a treaty between our two countries, but 160 countries ended up signing on to it. So it was like a big global treaty. And it said, unbelievably optimistically, war is illegal. You cannot use war to get your national agenda further. War is illegal. Why is that such an optimum? And the thing is, today, I don't know, today, there's lots of, I don't want to say hippies, but okay. Lots of folks that say, yeah, let's outlaw war. What's wrong with this treaty? How can you enforce it? What do you have to do to enforce it? Yeah, if somebody attacks you and you say war is illegal, you guys are violating the law, what do you have to do in order to prosecute? In order to stop them? You have to fight them, right? So it's one of those laws that's just not possible. And yet it does reflect, oddly enough, even though the United States was worried that Europe's ideas were dominating, what's odd is that by the 1920s, America's ideas really do become more dominant. Even though we're not part of the League of Nations, and we really have very little to do with the rise of World War II. And again, when World War II starts, we don't jump in because we're afraid that it's really being dominated by these old ideas. But it's not the same as World War I. World War I, we really didn't like anybody. We didn't think England was good. We didn't think Germany was good. They're all bad. I don't mean like bad countries, but following an old style that's basically rule of might. World War II, clearly, one side was following the rule of might. Hitler, Mussolini, Stalin, Japan. And one style was following the rule of law. England, France, and eventually the United States. When the Cold War erupts, when World War II is over, Germany is no longer a power. Japan is no longer a power. Italy is no longer a threat. I mean, they're countries, but they're no longer military threats. And so you have a vacuum. And who fills in that monopoly of rule of might? Germany's not there anymore. Japan's not there anymore. Italy's not there anymore. Who's the only country left?
Russia.
Russia. So, and that's the whole story of the Cold War. The Cold War is this rule of might versus the rule of law. But by this time, it's not just the United States. It's England, it's France, it's the free world. And so then we see this story slowly begin. So today, what I really want to get, and I'll do it through some details, but I want you to see Europe's trends. And I'll just be frank. It's about rule of might. They're not doing it as viciously as, say, Napoleon did, right? Where he's literally trying to take over the rest of the world. But it's still the same concept. If you have enough force, if you have enough military, you can make sure people will do what you want them to do. The new idea, which is what the West is going to do, what the United States is doing, is rule by law. If you establish laws, this will work. Now, before I get into this, let me just ask you guys in plain English. This isn't a history question. This is a your common sense question. Which one of those two works? Rule of might or rule of law? Boy, you guys are cynical. Don't be afraid.
Over history, I feel like
Plato wrote about this exact same question 2,400 years ago. Plato's Republic, that's the whole story. Which is more powerful, the rule of might or rule of law? This is one of these kind of universal questions, philosophical questions, doesn't go away. It's part of human nature. The Greeks are talking about it, the Romans are talking about it. It's constant. And here we see it in action in the 20th century. And I don't mean to say you guys are cynical, like it doesn't make sense to think that the rule of might is more powerful than the rule of law. Because often it does. Of course, who won World War II?
Rule of law.
And how did that happen? Who won the Persian Wars between the Greeks and the Persians? And how did that happen? Why did it happen? And keep in mind, Plato is clearly thinking about these types of things too in his recent history. The rule of power seems like it should work because it's force, right? You're going to force them to do this. But what's the biggest weakness of the rule of power? Somebody else can always have more power. And so it's actually extremely expensive because you have to force people to follow your will. That's expensive. And I mean that not in terms of money. I mean that in terms of resources. In the end, who wins the Cold War? And why? Did we go in and take over the Soviet Union? What did the Soviet Union do?
They collapsed.
Because
They too much money into the military.
it's too expensive. And it's not just money. You're forcing people to do what you want them to do all the time. And you can do it for the short term, but you can't do it for the long term. That was Plato's argument, by the way. That it may look like it's more powerful. Frequently, it does. When some big bully wants to take your money, and you're in the right, and you're going to argue with them, with good words, you may lose that battle. Okay? But in the long run, the bully will lose. That's his basic argument. And in the same thing, we can see this historically. But this isn't a slam dunk issue. Because I'll throw one else in there. If you adhere to the rule of law, so let's say you are actually someone who abides by the laws you create. And so if you decide we're not going to create these weapons, if you say we're not going to violate these rules, this is my agreement. We are going to have these rules of war and we're going to stick to them. And then you are negotiating with somebody on the other side who does not respect law at all. Then what's going to end up happening? So you sit to it, and I'll just give you an example, because we're going to see this with World War II. We negotiate with Hitler. We say, Hitler, you cannot expand anymore. If you agree, after you've taken this little section of Czechoslovakia, because you decide this is required, if you've taken this and you've agreed not to take anything more, we will recognize your sovereignty, we'll give in to your demands. But you have to promise not to take anything more. What, if you don't believe in law, what are you going to do with this agreement? Well, first of all, are you going to sign it?
No.
Yes, of course you're going to sign it, right? Because what does it matter to you? And what do you get to buy? At least that much time, because the other side has agreed not to do anything to you because you've agreed, right? But then, does it stop you from doing what you want to do? Okay. It's just a piece of paper. And we'll take it one step further. So we're Iraq. We are Iran, and we are building nuclear weapons. And the country says you're not supposed to build nuclear weapons. They say, oh, no. This is just for nuclear power. And they say, you cannot use this for nuclear power. But if you promise, because I know you need the power, if you promise not to use it for nuclear power, we'll give you, or nuclear weapons, we'll give you the tools in order to make nuclear power. What is Iran going to say? Absolutely, right? But if they don't care about the agreement, what also are they going to do?
Break the agreement.
Break the agreement. But because we agree to law, can we do anything in the short term? No, because we believe in law. So this is where Joey's kind of cynicism pops up. In the short term, who has the advantage? The people that have the power. And this is where optimism and the progressive interpretation kind of has a hard role to hold. Because it's not a short-term gain. It's the long term. You recognize that in the long run, the guy who has the power of might is not going to be successful because he has to constantly force people to support him. In the long run, the rule of law, you have people that want to win with you. They want to be on your side. They want to rise up and overthrow that kind of stuff. But it's not usually immediate. It's long term. So this isn't an easy slam dunk case, and I'll promise you, there are professors, a bulk of them, majority of them, most of these dialectical types, totally disagree with it. They would say the rule of law is pretend, it's fictitious, nobody ever follows it, only the rule of might. They may disguise their law or their might in terms of law, but it's all rule of might. Painful. It's okay. You guys can have whatever argument you want. This is the overview. Questions on this? Comments on this? You guys get where we're going from? Okay. We're trying to explain the difference between, say, the European perspective and the U.S. perspective. But within the European perspective, you guys understand that even within them, there are different extremes, right? So, and I'm not going to give them labels, I'm just going to say A or B. And then here, the U.S. is on the opposite side. So that's why we use the terms liberal and conservative. This is why you need to understand them, that they're different. But you do know that these definitions change all the time. Liberal in 1800, not the same as liberal in 1900, and totally not the same as liberal in 2000. Go ahead.
Liberal just means more government.
That's what it means today. Liberal in 1800 was the exact opposite. It meant less government.
What about liberal in 1900?
Okay. What I will say is technically, liberal means, if you look in the dictionary, it means open to change. Okay? And conservative, which is a super easy one, I'm just going to say conserve, right? Conserve. Conservative, this means wanting to keep the status quo. And so, obviously, if those are the actual differences, if these are the definitions, clearly they have to change over time, right? Because if everybody is a monarch, then the guys who want to keep monarchy would be conservatives. The guys who want to get rid of monarchy would be liberals. Well, what's the next step for monarchy? Remember we talked about this. Do you guys remember? It goes from monarchy and then it goes
Aristocracy.
aristocracy, the aristoi, right? Aristoi means the best. Generally, it's when the parliaments are ruling. The aristoi, the best, right? Well, the aristoi, the aristocracy, are liberals compared to the monarchs, right? But who takes over the aristocracy?
Democracy.
Democracy, demos, the people. So those who support democracy are liberals to the aristocracy. But aren't they also liberals to the monarchs? Monarchs are conservative to the aristocracy, but the aristocracy are conservative to the democracy. Here's a crazy one. What about anarchy? And this would be radicals. And I don't know if I explained what that meant here. Did I explain that in this class? I know I did for your...
Yeah, you did.
Anarchy just means no government. What it means is that every individual is his own government. But radicalism means that you're changing government outside of the system. Do we have radicalism in the United States? We do, but not really. Radicals are the ones that kill the leader, right? They have revolutions. That's radicalism. Because you don't go through. We might have reform, which is you want change, but how do we get reform in the United States? You vote them out, right? But that means you're using the existing system. Okay, go ahead. What were you going to say, Joey? And then I'm going to ask Lynette because she's got this question in her mind. Go
Well, it's
ahead.
going to just be like arguments in
No, it's okay. Please do it.
I was under the assumption that radical meant abrupt, like very fast change immediately.
Okay, it's not a bad definition, but it wouldn't be technically accurate. Reform is to change. Okay, radical. What you might be conflating the term is revolution. Revolution is a radical change, right? It's also abrupt, and almost always outside of the system. But radical, if you have a radical idea, that means that you have an idea that requires you to go outside of the existing system. If you're a monarch and you're an aristocrat and you say, I think people should be able to vote based off of their family heritage and not just because you're a royal, that's actually kind of a radical idea if you force it. Usually you kill the king. And in fact, that's what they did in England, right? They knocked on Charles I's door and they said, you can no longer be king because you violated our rights, the rights of the aristocracy, and they cut his head off. Big civil war followed. This is not democracy, it was aristocracy that's doing it. So they're radicals. Democracy. The Americans were radical, weren't they? When we send the letter to King George III and say, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, you're not protecting them. Government exists to protect those rights. If you don't protect them, you either change or you get kicked out. You don't change, and so now we're declaring our independence from you. That's a radical system. We're going outside of those rules. So we were radicals. But once you're a Democrat, in other words, once you are into democracy where you vote for changes, the only way that you can be a radical is if you try to do something outside the system. Does this make sense? The key here, liberal, conservative, the definitions totally change. What would be more liberal than a Democrat? Go to anarchy, but really? Is that more liberal, or is it actually just radical? Okay, so, Lynette, you're shaking your head.
I was so sure walking in today.
Are you worried about what your answer is?
Yeah, I was so sure about
Okay,
my
your
answer.
answer's right.
Cool.
Your answer's right. This isn't wrong. How did I confuse you? No, you gotta go change it. You're right. I don't see where your answer is. Okay, you're right. You're right. Okay, pull them out. You're right. Okay, good. Now give them all to me so I know that. So why weren't you? What did I say that caused
The definitions change.
Yeah, the definition. Well, in 1900, now if we had the United States, what would the answer be?
United States.
The United States, right? The United States would be more liberal in 1900. In 1900, who is liberal and who is conservative? What does it mean to be conservative? Well, we've got the three. We've got the king, we've got the aristocracy, we've got the democracy. The king would definitely be conservative. Who else would be conservative? Aristocracy. Where is democracy? They're liberal, right? So what was the United States? Democracy. In fact, how many true democracies were in Europe?
England?
Not yet. Close. Not yet. You did not have everybody being able to vote in England in 1900. It wasn't until closer to 1915, basically to World War I. More people did. By 1870s, more people voted. In 1800, there's nobody voting except the people that have land. What they did is they reduced the property requirements. And so by doing that, you expand the number of people that can have voting rights. Where was France? Back and forth and back and forth. They had a king, but their local stuff was increasingly more voting. So, and sometimes they were conservative, and sometimes they were on the liberal side. They kept going back and forth, but generally they were behind England. Where was Germany? Germany, we talked about this, remember?
Kaiser.
Yeah, they had the Kaiser, who was the emperor, Caesar. Think Kaiser, Caesar, like the Tsar, same way. And they had a wonderful constitution where everybody voted on everything. But did the votes matter? No. In the end, they could only advise the Kaiser. The Kaiser decided whatever he wanted to do. And so that's conservative. What about the Tsar in Russia? No even pretend voting in Russia. Right? It's one of the reasons why they had a revolution, because they had no movement. The point here is that Europe was not one thing. It's never been one thing. It's one of the problems when you read at the very beginning of world history and Western civilization, they talk about the Europeans taking over the Americas as if Europe was one thing. It never was. Not even the Spanish were one thing. The missionaries were different from the conquistadors, who were different from the traders, who were different from the explorers. It's different, but even on a national level, Europe has differences of ideology. This seems confusing, but it's actually not. In terms of politics, one person rules, a few people rule, many people rule, everybody except one. Use terms like liberty. People who vote for liberty, what they mean is they want to have most people having a voice. That's what they mean by liberty. Order, who people say, well, I don't want everybody to vote, because then the ditch digger can vote, the poop scooper can vote. And they're going to be voting for crazy things. Only the intelligent, only the best should be able to vote. That's aristocracy. Monarchy, autocracy, I know I'm going to make it right. Again, Aristotle talked about these things 2,500 years ago. Aristotle and Plato both. Who's the best possible government, he said. The best possible government.
The people?
No.
Is it a trick question?
No. I mean, it will be when you explain it, but it's not. The best government. A noble monarch. Somebody who is really good as a king. Because then there's no inefficiency. He wants to get it done, he does it. That's the best form of government. What's the worst form of government? A bad monarch. It's true. It's the worst because he has some evil in mind. He doesn't. There's no checks against him. And because of the possibility of the evil monarchy, we temper it. And that's why you have the aristocracy. Aristocracy is not as efficient as a monarchy. But it can be good, especially if they're noble, if they really are the best. But on the other hand, what happens if they all become corrupt? Then it's going to be not quite as bad as the noble, as the tyrant, but close. So democracy is right in the middle. It's settling. It's not the best form of government. But it's much less likely to have a tyranny of the majority, which is what you have to have. A tyranny of the majority. And so since that's less likely, we settle for democracy. You don't get as much done. It's constantly inefficient. When you hear people saying, yeah, we should get rid of these rules. I wish that those other people would just go away and this, whoever the politician is, could just simply do it. What do we call it when he just simply does it? We call that monarchy, and we don't believe in that in the United States. Constitutionalism, the checks and balances, the whole point is to make it really inefficient, to slow you down. So that if you're a bad guy, it's hard for you to do bad things. If you're a good guy, on the other hand, if you're a good guy, it's hard for you to do the good things. But that's the price of democracy. If we could be assured that we had one good guy every single time, the noble monarch would be best. But we can't. We don't have that assurance. That makes sense? That's the political system. Well, the fact is, that's politics. Conservatives, liberals, they change over time. We also have conservative and liberals on different aspects of it. And so when I talk about economics, this is a different spectrum. It's not the same as talking about politics. One leader, a few leaders. Economics is about whether the government is going to be involved with it or not. If there's no government involved, that's left, we call laissez-faire. Private enterprise. People get to do whatever they want to do. Right? And the consumers determine who wins and who doesn't. If you have the government regulating and controlling everything, this is essentially communism, where the government owns everything. There is no private property. That's the extreme, the vast extreme. The government owns everything, no private property. So that would be on the far right, which is ironic and all sorts of things, but I won't tell you why. But that's the spectrum. Yes, go ahead.
It says all government involved in the economic scale of
Yes.
capitalism.
Yes. Yes. It's funny because that's not what we think of it, is it?
No,
Because the definitions change over time. So Adam Smith comes up with this idea called wealth of nations, where the government doesn't get involved at all. And he is called a liberal. So in 1800, we could talk about classical liberal economic theory. Today, if I'm talking about conservative economic theory, where do I fall? I'm on this side. Because definitions change. What Adam Smith was reacting against was mercantilism, where the government basically determined who's going in and who's going out. We don't really have mercantilism today. We have free market, which is really a liberal argument. No government involved with this. Definitions change. And so this is not what it means today. If I say someone is an economic conservative, I actually mean he doesn't want any government involved. If I say he's an economic liberal, I mean that he wants to have lots of government involved. But that's changed, right? Why would it change? I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but if liberal means to change, and if Adam Smith was making the argument that you have no government involved, and he's in the past, if you want to keep that, what would you be?
Conservative.
You would be conservative. The reason why they're called economic conservatives is that our tradition in the United States is to have laissez-faire, less government involvement. That's our tradition, so we want to keep that. Does that make sense? And the people that want to increase the government would be liberals. They want to change that. The concept of a liberal and conservative, these definitions change all the time. So you have to be a little bit clear. When we say classical liberal economics, that's what we're talking about, Adam Smith. When we say modern economics, then you actually mean a conservative who wants to keep that old Adam Smith idea. Confusing, but it's not. It's not confusing if you think about it. It just means that when you use something like conservative and economic, you have to be really, really careful. Because they don't mean all the same things. Another thing, morals, conservative. What does it mean, conservative standard? God created the world. So God has some idea of how we ought to act. One standard. The opposite to that. There is no God. So we can all decide on what we ought to do. There's no standard of morality. Now it's funny, it depends on what you want to do, which side you want to be on, right? If you want to be able to, sleep around or do this or do that, you say, well, I don't know, it's up to whatever I want to. So I'm on the liberal morality. And then if somebody says, well, you know what? I think we should all vote to kill all red-headed people. Because if there's no standard, isn't that perfectly just? Or how about this? Why don't we all vote to kill all the Jews? Suddenly not so crazy, right? The Germans voted Hitler in. He didn't take over. If you have no standard, you can support anything, right? Now, I know we don't think about that. We think, well, it's me, freedom, I want to be able to do whatever I want to do. But that's your argument. If you really believe that there's no moral standard, that means there is no moral standard. So even the things that you don't like are acceptable. The funny thing is that most people in modern today, because we have pornography and all sorts of naughty stuff all over everyone, they kind of put themselves on this side because they don't really test it. Some of the most intolerant meetings I've ever been to? You can guess. The most intolerant meetings I've been to are meetings about tolerance.
That's ironic.
But isn't it? Because what's the whole point about these kind of tolerance things? What are you saying? If you don't allow everything, you are a bigot, sexist, homophobe, whatever. Am I wrong on this? Isn't that, and you get in there, if you say, well, I'm definitely for racial equality, I don't know if I support gay marriage, then you should be thrown away. The level of intolerance is extremely high. Go ahead.
Does this kind of also go with what we talked about with film, the baby boomers?
Totally. Absolutely.
But this is before. This
Well,
what we're talking about right now is a little bit before, right?
Well, this is actually the baby boomer thing.
Okay.
What was ironic is no one debated this, really. I shouldn't say that. The French Revolution debated this a great deal. That's why they invented the guillotine to chop people's head off, because they said, you don't agree with me, we're going to catch you up. If you really think about it, if there's no standard, then how do you establish any standards? You vote on it. So what about the people that don't agree with you? There's no standard, right? So is there anything wrong just getting rid of them? That's where you get the head chopping off. Hitler, do you think he's a religious guy or a totally non-religious guy? Totally non. I mean, the exact opposite of non. He thought of himself as a scientist. Religion was something that people used to make other people weak. Compassion is something that you give to somebody else to try to let the strong be handicapped. Totally non-religious. Yes?
Was it Hitler who followed Nietzsche's?
It's exactly right. Nietzsche. Who's Nietzsche?
Said there was no God.
There's no God, right? And that religion was used in order to prevent the strong from being stronger. It's kind of like a conspiracy created by weak people in order to protect themselves. And if you think about it, because what does religion say? You should help the
Needy.
poor, the needy. It's all a big conspiracy. So if you just wipe that out, then the needy just fall off to the side, and the strong survive. And the strong should always win, right? This is Nietzsche's argument, and this is totally Hitler's argument. My big point here, there is no unification. There's no unity in Europe. And so when we talk about Europe, you have to realize that they're totally different sides. Most folks were on the one standard side in the 1800s, most of the 1900s. In terms of economics, most were somewhere on this side. England was closer to this side. The United States was over on this side. Most of Europe was probably on this side. Politically, most of Europe is going to be on this side. The United States was here. You need to get this in order to get this whole point about different trends. Does that make sense? Okay. Question. Should you know these things? Yeah, you should. Is it?
I always assumed liberal and democrat were kind of the same.
They are today, but it's a changeable term. Okay. Why do they change? I'm sorry, it's just one of those things. Well, how about this? Greater and lesser. What does it mean to be greater or lesser? Depends, right? So it's a changing term, and that's all it means. You keep it the same, or you want to change. But it depends on what it is right now that will determine what that means. You guys will be good, I promise. Super quick. Napoleon, and the irony here is that Napoleon rose as a result of the French Revolution. Remember, France was mostly conservative in terms of being the king. They had King Louis XVI. Queen Antoinette was very famous for somebody, and it wasn't a true story, by the way, but somebody comes up to her and said, the peasants have no food. And what was her supposed response? But they have no bread. They have no bread? Well, let them eat cake. You know, the idea is that there's so much variety that if they don't have any bread, well, then they just eat the cake, right? Well, what are they saying? They have no bread because they have no food, no money. And so the idea was that she was so far removed that she had no idea about the poverty. Now, just to let you know, not a real story. Didn't actually happen. But it's very famous. Hadn't you guys ever heard that when you were a kid? Let them eat cake. It's very famous. Not real. Doesn't matter. The point is that France has this strong monarchy. Unlike England, 100 years earlier, the English overthrew their monarchy. And the aristocracy took over. And in the United States, we pretty much overthrew the aristocracy. But in France, nothing of this had happened. They were still monarchs in 1789. So they have a revolution. And at first, the revolution was just the parliament overthrowing the king. And it wasn't bloody at all, hardly. You had the storming the Bastille, you had a little uprising, but mostly very sane. And the people who had money and some wealth and education were saying the king needs to be removed, we need to go back to an aristocracy, kind of like England. Well, within about a year or two, some of the academics, I'm going to blame university professors because that's pretty much what happened, started rallying up the people and saying, things haven't changed for you. You need to stand up and make a change right now. Instead of going reform, which means you go through the system, we want radical change, which means we want to tear everything down. And that's what you think of as the French Revolution. It's the second half of the French Revolution. We usually refer to it as the Reign of Terror. And that's really when they started rounding up anyone who had any money and killing them. The guillotine was invented. The guillotine was invented to kill people faster. Because remember, before that, you don't have guns, firing squads that you can do this quickly enough because you have to fire it every time. So you just chop off their heads, how they were executed. But if you think about it, one big axe, it's hard to do that. You have to sharpen it all the time. And what if you miss? Or if it's dull, you have to keep whacking at it. And it's grotesque, but if you're dealing with hundreds a day, this is a very real problem. So they invent the guillotine with a cool little slanted blade. Cool in a really disgusting way. But because of the way it happens every time, right off. And so they can literally kill hundreds of people in a day, which would take ages. Because their lists of people that were criminal was outrageously high. Not only did they kill the king and his wife, anybody who had a title was suspect. Anybody who had lands that weren't willing to give them up were suspect. Religious folks were suspect. They wanted to destroy the system. Now, this caused fear everywhere. Because there's crowns everywhere. So if it can happen in France, it can happen anywhere else, right? And so immediately they started attacking France. Everybody attacks France. Because the whole idea was radical. And in the midst of this attacking, Napoleon rises up as a guy who's a really good cannoneer. He knows how to deal with cannons. And he is able to push back attacks on Paris. In the process, he's able to kind of help restore order. The radicals are kicked out. The reformers kind of come back in. They're still revolutionaries, but they're not the ones that are trying to kill everybody. By the way, the guy who started the revolution also lost his head, Robespierre. It's just kind of the nature of the beast. You could say this is the example of what happens when you pursue rule of power. You live by the sword, you die by the sword, right? So Napoleon rises up. Here's the irony of irony. Napoleon rises up in the midst of a revolution designed to overthrow the king, and within about 6 years, what happens to him? He becomes emperor. He gets crowned king. Not just king, but actually emperor at a higher level than King Louis XVI was. And everyone supports him. Why? Because he's really good. And he takes over all of Europe. And he keeps pushing this direction. And in 1812, he actually pushes into Russia. You guys ever watch Princess Bride? There's two fatal blunders. The most obvious one is don't start a land war in Russia. What's he talking about? Well, because Napoleon goes into Russia with 600,000 people, and he leaves with 40,000. And when he leaves, he actually leaves his 40,000 behind, and they have to follow. He just flees. Don't start a land war. It's actually don't start a land war in Asia, but that's what they're talking about. The point is that Napoleon has taken over all of Europe except when he goes into Russia. Now, this is important for World War I because Russia thinks that they defeated Napoleon. What actually defeated Napoleon? The winter. What Napoleon did was that he went in, and all the Russians they just moved. So when he goes into a city, they all fled the city. And they burned things behind him. So when he gets to the city, there's nothing there. So he goes on to the next city, finds that it's also burned. And the Russians are the ones that burned it. Now they're destroying things, but why would they do that?
So that the can't resupply. Yeah.
Can't get the supplies. And so by the time Napoleon's in the middle of it and it's winter, he's got no shoes for his men, no food, they start starving. That's why you're losing 500,000, 560,000. They just die from the elements. And that's why he flees, because he can't supply them. This is important to understand because Napoleon, who takes over all Europe, Russia thinks, and the rest of the world thinks, nobody can defeat Russia. Napoleon defeated everybody else, but didn't defeat Russia. What does that make Russia feel like?
They're invincible.
They're invincible. Very important to understand. Okay. It's not true, by the way. These are all the little things of Germany. Where do you see the word Germany? You don't. Okay. These are all the little things of Italy. Where do you see the word Italy? You don't. Up until 1860, there is no Germany, there is no Italy. So when Napoleon is defeated, who actually defeats Napoleon, by the way? I know he loses a big army in Russia, but who is it?
The English.
It's English, right? And what happens, Napoleon comes out of Russia, he gets defeated. They send him off to an island to scrub rocks, and after about a year, his people go take him off the island. He goes back to Russia, France. He builds up another army. He goes out, and he gets defeated. And what's the big famous name of the battle that he gets defeated? Waterloo. And so when somebody says, "This is my Waterloo," what does that mean?
Final battle.
Final battle. Who loses? Napoleon loses. Who wins? England. From this point, major power struggle between England and France for years and years. France is defeated. Who is the power of the world?
England.
England. Go ahead.
Was he much less powerful on that second time?
He was less powerful just to begin with. But also, he just didn't have... the opponents, England, was just way better at what they were doing by this time. I mean, they were better. So, he's going to be defeated. The point is that when the war is over, England puts in a new puppet government in France. So they have a king, but he's not going to be strong. He's never going to be strong. France will never again be strong. Today, we don't think of France like the main military power in the world, right? We kind of make fun of them a little bit. It's okay. We shouldn't, but we do. So France is never going to be strong. England is powerful. Who else is powerful? Well, there's nobody here. So we assume Russia is kind of powerful because they helped to defeat Napoleon. But what's the threat of Russia in here? Nothing. So the point is that in 1815, you kind of establish a balance of powers. But England really is the most powerful because they're all over the world. If they're all over the world, are they really trying to influence Europe directly? No. Instead, they help France to kind of have an influence because they know that France can never be a military power. So what does this mean in plain language? Well, between 1850 and 1875, what two countries emerged?
Germany.
Italy and Germany. Prussia will become Germany. Austria is the Austrian Empire. That's still there, but it's going to be taken over. In order to be Germany, all the German-speaking people have to unite. I'll just be real blunt. They can't unite without war. And the guy who's in charge of Prussia uses war over and over and over again. He defeats his neighbors. He'll fight against France, and by fighting against France, he causes the Germans to want to come together. He's using war over and over again with the sole purpose of uniting. And in the end, they unite all these people under Germany. Austria doesn't join. Why doesn't Austria join? Austria has the title of Holy Roman Emperor. The head of Austria is an emperor. Why do you think he doesn't want to join Germany? Yes! It's Prussia who's doing all this. If they go in, they cease to exist. That's why you get Germany and Austria. But in fact, what language do they all speak? German. They're all German. In terms of the people, they're all German. But Austria doesn't want to be a part of it. Is this going to be a big deal? Kind of. Italy in 1860 is going to be the first one to unite. And there's all sorts of little states. You've got this guy who's like Italian, I want to be the next Rome, and then you've got more of a pragmatic guy. Remember we talked about pragmatism, practical? So he's willing to use this kind of nationalism, romantic nationalism, in order to unite. And how do they unite? What's going to happen to unite? War, over and over and over again. Well, 1860 they unified. Same thing is going to happen in Germany. All these countries are going to unify through constant war. What's the United States doing when we see all this?
They're isolated.
Okay. Austria, throughout all this conflict, just gets weaker and weaker and weaker. And so by the time we're done, Austria actually breaks into parts. It used to be called the Austria-Hungary Empire. So what happens? Hungary breaks off. Austria, Bohemia, Moravia, Slovakia. What is this one? Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia, Sarajevo. There's one in here that is not going to pop up yet, but it will pop up. You know what I'm talking about? Which one I'm talking about? What is Serbia? This is where Franz Ferdinand gets killed. Okay, we got like 5 minutes here to make sure you understand. If you look at the big map, Russia is trying to get bigger, and it thinks it's very powerful. Germany is bigger. And at the time, at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, it wasn't even thought of because it didn't exist. But by 1870, it is now a massive, powerful kingdom. And how did it get that way? Through constant war. So what does its military look like? It's a very, very powerful, high-technology military. In 1900, they have airplanes, they have tanks, they have machine guns, they have poison gas, they developed submarines. That's how they united, was through constant war. So Germany, very powerful. What's happening in Austria-Hungary? It's getting weaker and weaker. And what's happening is that Austria is just falling apart. Now Turkey is also falling apart, which means that you have all these little countries that didn't exist 50 years earlier. What does that mean? Well, they're new, young countries, but what does that make them vulnerable to? Being taken over. And who really, really wants to take them over?
Russia.
Because what does Russia want more than anything?
Warm water port.
A warm water port. So you can see where this is a problem. Does Germany... Go ahead. Oh, I thought you had a hand up. Does Germany want Russia to have that warm water port?
No.
Germany is also brand new, and it wants to establish itself as a major power. What about England? Does England want Russia to have the warm water port?
No.
No. But does England want Germany to be happy that Russia doesn't get that warm water port? So who is England going to like more, Germany or Russia?
Russia.
Russia. England is going to be busy fighting both sides, supporting the Turks against the Russians, and then supporting the Russians against the Germans. And because England's got its fingers all over the world, they can do things like that. Balance of power. It's not about ideology, it's about doing what needs to be done. Now we can see where World War I comes up here, right? Because it's in here that the head, the heir to the head of the Austrian throne gets killed. Franz Ferdinand is the Archduke. We don't know this because we don't have titles. Archduke means he's the next guy in line. And he's the head of the Austrians. Well, for years, the Russians have been helping the nationalists, Serbian nationalists, because Russia wants all these guys to be independent. Because what will eventually happen? If they're all really independent, if Austria is kicked out of all these things, then who can they turn to?
Russia.
Russia, and then Russia can go through just as they wish. So they've been supporting the Serbian nationalists, people that want to kick out the Austrians. And where does this Archduke get killed? In Serbia. By who? A Serbian nationalist. And so who do we blame for the killing? Russia. Does Russia actually orchestrate this? No. Does that really matter? No. Because what you have here is a situation where everybody wants change. Germany wants to be respected as the main power in Europe, not France and not England. England is all over the world. Why should they be in Europe? France was defeated in the Napoleonic Wars. Germany wants to be the next guy. They fought all these wars in order to unite. Now they want to be able to expand a little bit. And they don't necessarily want to take over. They just want to be respected as the power in Europe. Russia thinks it already is the power in Europe. They want this warm water port. Austria is losing things day by day, and they don't want to lose any more. Turkey does not want Russia to go through here, because Turkey has constantly been fighting Russia. But they don't like the Austrians either. But they would rather support the Austrians to prevent Russia from going through than allowing Russia. England, who is focused on the world, doesn't want things to change. And so England, kind of like the pacification model, is trying to support Russia to keep Germany down. It's a balance of power. Very conflict. What does it really mean? Everybody wants war. When the Archduke is assassinated, nobody thinks really that Russia did this. But Austria asked Germany, will you support us if we get in a war with Russia? Germany says yes. Will you support us if we get in a war with France? And Austria says yes. And so, okay, this will be our opportunity. You can attack Serbia because you know that Russia will support them. That'll end up getting you in a war with Russia. Ottomans and Austria will both attack Russia at the same time. And Russia will attack both of these guys. While they are now busy, Russia cannot stop Germany from attacking France. They're going to go through Belgium, go into France. And their hope is to get France ripped out so quickly that England does not have a chance to cross the channel and be there. And when they're done, in 6 weeks, the war will be over. Of course, on the other side are the English, who said this is a perfect opportunity to put Germany back down in its place. We can use this opportunity to kind of test the boundaries of Russia, let them expand a little bit in order to push Germany back down. We have a big military, we're the biggest empire in the world, we can do this in 6 weeks, it's over. Russia says, this is our chance, we can finally get a warm water port. If we attack, we can probably plow all the way through and have Russia right there in the Mediterranean. We defeated Napoleon, we can defeat anybody. 6 weeks war. What actually happens?
Doesn't last 6 weeks.
The military technology is way more advanced than anybody understands. Russia is well under-advanced. Had no idea what they were up against. They are being creamed by both the Austrians and the Ottomans, but both of these guys, all three of them are low-tech. So they're fighting and they're dying by the thousands and thousands. Germany and England are way more overpowered. England gets into France before Germany even knows it. They get stuck in Belgium, and so they fight a trench warfare that lasts for years. And the death tolls are astronomical. More English and French die in World War I than in all of World War II. Go ahead.
Don't you need like a 3-to-1 ratio?
You need a 3-to-1 ratio to defeat a defensive army, and they are 1-to-1. And so it just means you're just going to kill and kill and kill and kill. This is the war. Now, before the war starts, the United States looks at everybody and says, you don't need to fight. We just sit down and check it out. We'll find out who actually killed the Archduke. We talked to Germany, France, and England. You don't need to fight. There's nobody even threatened in here. And we all got letters back. And I read these letters. Notes, very short, about 2 or 3 sentences. And they said to the United States, we appreciate your concern. We appreciate your offer to help. No, thank you. Why? Because they wanted this war. So when Europe erupts in war, the United States immediately says, we're not involved. Why?
Because of George Washington's.
Because of George Washington's, but even more bluntly than that, we look at this as a battle over empires, and it's corrupt. The United States doesn't believe in that. Now we're going to talk about this a little bit on Monday, just a little bit. Because in the end, I already told you the story, the United States does get involved with this war. Not because they want to, but because their ships get blown out. And they said, we'll get in this war as long as we can promise to completely change the world order and put democracy. So no more balance of power, no more treaties, none of this stuff. People have a right to exist just as they are. Unfortunately, with the Treaty of Versailles, we thought that we got conned. We'll talk about this. But the point is that the idea of law enters into the vocabulary. It doesn't get taken until we see Hitler rising up and we see the power of this rule of might, and we cannot do this. Because if we keep having rule of might dominate the world, how many wars are we going to have? Every 20 years there'll be another world war. We can't do that. And so then the American view takes ascendancy, and that's what dominates the Cold War. Questions? Comments? Original wisdom. We'll see you guys Monday. Monday? Monday. Okay, see you later.